The air in the Bataan Division command post reeks of defeat as U.S. Army Major General William Brougher delivers the final orders to his exhausted surviving officers. Destroy all weapons, burn classified documents, prepare to raise the white flag. It's April 9th, 1942, and for over 75,000 American and Filipino soldiers trapped on the Bataan Peninsula on the island of Luzon, giving themselves up to the Japanese is the only option left. But Major Russell Volckmann has heard what they do to their prisoners. He hasn't fought this hard to wind up in some hellish POW camp, starving in a bamboo cage, or worse. He's got something else in mind. Volckmann knows it's now or never. Quote, "Sir, I'd like permission not to surrender." Over the previous months, Volckmann had watched his 11th Infantry Regiment shrink from over 1,000 men to a fraction of that number. They'd fought from Lingayen Gulf all the way down to this godforsaken peninsula, desperately trying to buy time that had run out long ago. As a West Point cadet in the early 1930s, the young man from Clinton, Iowa, had set his sights on adventure in the tropical Philippines. But when he graduated in the bottom half of his class, he'd been sent to the less exotic climes of Fort Snelling, Minnesota instead. For 6 long years, he refused to give up hope, remaining on the waiting list in case any opportunity of a Philippine posting arose. Finally, after writing directly to the Chief Adjutant General in Washington and practically begging him to let him go, he was given his chance, arriving in Manila in the summer of 1940. As Division Intelligence Officer, Volckmann had been studying reports from northern Luzon. It seemed several fragmented units of American and Filipino soldiers were still up there, perhaps the equivalent of up to 4 regiments, regrouping in the mountains around Baguio. Maybe, just maybe, he could make it there and join them. His fellow officers certainly didn't seem to think it was possible. As he asked the general for permission not to hand himself in, the room was instantly filled with a shocked silence. What he was proposing seemed like utter madness. Only Captain Donald Blackburn, standing nearby, spoke up. Surprisingly, he wanted to go too. Brougher studied the 2 men for a long moment. What they were asking to do was extremely dangerous. They'd have no support, no supplies, no extraction if things went wrong. But if even a handful of Americans could remain active in the Philippines, it might just make a difference. Brougher wasn't going to fight them. He simply nodded his head and told them, quote, "I'll report you missing in action on a patrol. Best of luck to you." That night, as their unit formally surrendered, Volckmann and Blackburn crawled for hours, carefully evading capture by the Japanese forces swarming around them. By dawn on April 10th, the 2 officers disappeared into the jungle. Ahead of them lay a journey of more than 100 miles behind enemy lines toward distant mountains they'd never even laid eyes on before. The constant threat of enemy patrols meant they could not use any recognizable trail. They moved at night when possible, freezing in place whenever they heard voices or distant vehicle engines. More than once, they hid within earshot of Japanese troops, barely breathing, praying they wouldn't be discovered. Within days, Volckmann's boots began falling apart. The thick jungle floor, roots, rocks, streams, shredded what remained of the leather. Soon he was walking barefoot, then wrapping his feet in strips of fabric torn from his uniform. Yet footwear would soon be the least of his worries. As the weeks went by, Volckmann was first hit by malaria. His fever spiked so high he could barely stand. Then came dysentery, leaving him dehydrated and weak. Berry swelled his legs. Blackburn's condition wasn't much better. On some days, they were barely able to advance a single mile. There were moments, crawling through the jungle in a fever haze, when Volckmann wondered if he'd made the right choice. At least in a prison camp, they'd have a roof, maybe food, maybe medicine. But what saved them, and made the entire journey possible, were the Filipino civilians. Time and again, villagers risked everything to help 2 American strangers stumbling through their towns. In one village, the Guerrero family took them in for 2 whole months, nursing both men back from the edge while Japanese patrols searched nearby. Finally, on September 9th, 5 months after escaping Bataan, Volckmann and Blackburn reached their destination in northern Luzon. Colonels Martin Moses and Arthur Noble had gathered a ragtag group of American and Filipino soldiers, men who'd refused to surrender, men looking for a way to keep fighting. Volckmann studied the terrain around them. pine-covered mountains, narrow valleys, villages tucked into remote highlands. The Japanese would struggle to operate here. Supply lines would be difficult. But for guerrillas who knew the ground, who had the support of the locals, it was perfect. On October 1st, Colonel Moses organized the resistance fighters under his command. Within 2 weeks, the United States Armed Forces in the Philippines, northern Luzon, or USAFIP-NL, began carrying out coordinated attacks across the region. Volckmann and Blackburn joined a force led by Philippine Army Lieutenant Rufino Baldwin for raids on Japanese garrisons at San Iglo and Balatok. These guerrilla units were a far cry from the regular army. Most of the men had no uniform and fought barefoot. They were armed with whatever they could scavenge, capture, or build with their own hands. The lucky ones wielded leftover American M1 carbines in Springfields or captured Japanese Arisaka rifles, seized from the enemy after successful ambushes. Others carried the somewhat old-fashioned World War I-era Enfield rifles that had been the Philippine Army's standard issue before the war. But many had to improvise. Filipino gunsmiths crafted patik guns, homemade slam-fire shotguns and pistols built from plumbing pipe and scrap lumber. These crude weapons were often as dangerous to the user as to the target, but they were better than nothing. Explosives were equally improvised. Guerrillas manufactured grenades from dynamite, scrap metal, and bamboo tubes. To destroy bridges and cut Japanese supply lines, they wired 30-second fuses to unexploded 75mm artillery shells scavenged from battlefields, crude but effective demolition charges that would later be recognized as precursors to modern improvised explosive devices. Meanwhile, traditional Filipino bolo knives, long, heavy machetes, became standard combat weapons for close-quarters fighting. The initial wave of attacks, in which Volckmann and Blackburn participated, was overwhelmingly successful. Guerrillas carried out aggressive, direct assaults. They would hit the enemy hard, seize weapons and supplies, then quickly withdraw before reinforcements could be sent, disappearing back into the mountains. The Japanese would arrive to find entire garrisons wiped out, and no trace of who'd done it. Colonel Moses was triumphant. His USAFIP-NL had proven that the resistance in northern Luzon could be devastatingly effective. But the Japanese response would be swift and brutal. Imperial forces flooded northern Luzon with troops and networks of collaborators who reported guerrilla movements in exchange for money or protection. But they weren't just hunting armed units. They began terrorizing the population that they suspected of sheltering them. Japanese soldiers dragged villagers from their homes. Men were beaten in town squares. Women and children could only watch as their houses went up in flames. The message was clear. If you support the resistance, your entire community will pay the price. The pressure worked. Terrified civilians, facing brutal reprisals, began giving up names and locations. Fewer and fewer were willing to risk helping the guerrillas. Meanwhile, the Japanese had singled out Volckmann as a particular threat. As they interrogated Filipino villagers, they would ask about him by name. They knew who he was. They knew what he looked like. The net around him was tightening. In December 1942, Japanese forces hit Volckmann's headquarters at the Lukod sawmill. He barely escaped, abandoning supplies and equipment. Meanwhile, Moses was driven from his headquarters at Bobok. The organization scattered into the mountains, communications disrupted, units isolated. From remote highland hideouts, Volckmann watched smoke rising from villages that had helped them. He understood what had gone wrong. The USAFIP-NL had attacked too early, before building the intelligence networks needed to protect themselves or the civilians who sheltered them. They'd struck the Japanese without first eliminating the collaborators in their midst. They prioritized action over survival. Volckmann began rebuilding in the Ifugao province, starting from almost nothing. But this time, he was determined to do it right. Through the winter and spring of 1943, Volckmann slowly began assembling a new band of Filipino soldiers, some from the remnants of Philippine Army units, others from local villages. Meanwhile, Moses and Noble were still out there somewhere with their own forces, as were other small groups, but communication between them was sporadic. The only contact the various dispersed pockets of guerrillas had with the outside world was via Major Ralph Prager, who had a radio with which he could reach General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area Command in Australia. MacArthur, having been informed of the devastating results of the counter-guerrilla campaign, was concerned for the men's safety. Trying to take on the Japanese as a fighting force seemed increasingly reckless, and he believed Volckmann and his comrades would prove more useful to the war effort if they concentrated on staying alive and being the Allies' eyes and ears in Luzon. He told them to, quote, limit hostilities and contact with the enemy to the minimum. Your present mission as intelligence units can be of utmost value. They would not get a chance to receive further orders. In March, Brougher was captured, along with his radio. The guerrillas' link with the broader Allied forces had been completely severed. They were now totally alone. Yet 3 months later, on June 9th, Volckmann's intelligence agents informed him that Moses and Noble had also been taken prisoner. He knew the Japanese would show no mercy to the American officers who had led the guerrilla resistance movement within northern Luzon since its inception. He was right. Within weeks, both men were executed. At 31, Major Russell Volckmann was now the highest-ranking American officer in the region. As the new de facto commander of the USAFIP-NL, his first challenge was to reunite whatever resistance forces remained after the year-long Japanese counter-guerrilla campaign. He sent messengers into the highlands, re-established contact with isolated units, and slowly pulled them back together. By summer's end, roughly 2,000 men across northern Luzon acknowledged his authority. Now, Volckmann had to tackle the attempts to break the resistance. His agents infiltrated Japanese-controlled constabulary units and neighborhood associations, identifying and eliminating spies and others helping the enemy. Within months, the informant networks were broken. Collaborators fled to Japanese garrisons. Communities that had gone silent began providing the resistance with information about enemy movements again, through what was known as the bamboo telegraph, intelligence passing person to person, village to village, until it reached the guerrillas. With security established, Volckmann reorganized the guerrilla forces. By November 1943, he divided northern Luzon into 7 districts, each under a commander responsible for building a regiment. Early the following year, he set up a general headquarters for the USAFIP-NL in western Benguet, a permanent command post from which he could coordinate operations across all 7 districts. Throughout the first half of 1944, Volckmann's USAFIP-NL continued to expand. But he still had a major problem. He had no way to communicate with MacArthur and the SWPA. He was unable to let them know of his unit's progress, or even that they were still alive. The USAFIP-NL was still vastly outnumbered by the Japanese and could survive only so long without external support. Likewise, he had no idea of developments on the broader war. Would the Allies ever return to the Philippines, or had the guerrillas been written off and forgotten about? Finally, in July 1944, hope arrived. Volckmann got wind of a guerrilla group further south in central Luzon, led by Major Robert Lapham. And best of all, they had a radio. By passing messages through Lapham, Volckmann was able to re-establish contact with MacArthur's headquarters. It was slow and indirect, but after 16 months of silence, it was a lifeline. Fortunately, communication with Australia would soon become much easier for Volckmann. The following month, he finally got his hands on his own radio. He could now speak directly to the SWPA command. On October 20th, 1944, the news he'd waited over 2 years to hear finally arrived. MacArthur had landed at Leyte, 400 miles to the south. The general declared, quote, "I have returned." Volckmann had his men spread the message throughout northern Luzon, but he added something of his own, a reminder of what his guerrillas had accomplished when MacArthur was gone, quote, "We remained." Volckmann wouldn't have to wait long for his chance to show MacArthur what he was capable of. 10 days after the Leyte landings, he received an urgent message. Mrs. Esperanza Osmeña, wife of Philippine President-in-exile Sergio Osmeña, was trapped in Baguio under Japanese military police custody. Through guerrilla agents, she managed to contact Volckmann at his headquarters, begging for rescue. Volckmann studied the situation. Baguio was deep in enemy-controlled territory. The Japanese Kempeitai military police were holding the president's wife under close guard. One mistake would mean her execution and the loss of his men. On October 30th, Volckmann's 66th Infantry embarked on the mission. Using a simple but clever distraction, a peanut seller lured the Japanese guards away from the house. His men sprinted Mrs. Osmeña and her family to safety. They then began a grueling 50-mile trek across the mountains back to Volckmann's headquarters. The rescue was a complete success. The family would remain under Volckmann's protection for several months, with Mrs. Osmania's pregnant daughter-in-law even giving birth to a baby boy in one of Yusufip NL's field hospitals in November. As winter 1944 approached, Volckmann's Yusufip NL had grown even larger than its original strength, from 2,000 scattered fighters to over 18,000 organized guerrillas across 5 regiments. They controlled the mountains, villages, and intelligence networks across 15,000 square miles of northern Luzon. Volckmann had built an army and had shown MacArthur and the world that it was capable of not just surviving, but pulling off complex operations right under Japanese noses. Yet it wasn't just high-profile rescue missions that were demonstrating just how valuable Volckmann and his men could be to the newly arrived Allied forces in Luzon. Intelligence reports flowed daily from Yusufip NL headquarters to Southwest Pacific Command. Japanese troop movements, supply depot locations, defensive positions, strengths, and weaknesses. Nonetheless, the coming fight couldn't be won with intelligence alone. Volckmann's 18,000 guerrillas were ready to prove their mettle on the battlefield, but they would need weapons, ammunition, and medicine. MacArthur arranged for submarines to begin supplying the Philippine coast. On a moonless night in November 1944, Volckmann stood on a darkened beach as USS Gar surfaced offshore. His men worked through the night, unloading crates of weapons, ammunition, medicine, and supplies, before the submarine disappeared back into the depths at dawn. More submarines would follow in the coming weeks, each delivery transforming Volckmann's troops into a more threatening fighting force. In late December, with his men fully equipped, the message Volckmann had been waiting for finally arrived from 6th Army headquarters. In 4 days, Yusufip NL would begin full-scale offensive operations. No more hiding, no more limiting contact with the enemy. Volckmann drafted orders to his district commanders across northern Luzon: destroy bridges, cut telephone lines, attack supply convoys, isolate Japanese garrisons, make it impossible for enemy forces to move or communicate. On January 4th, 1945, he gave the command. Across 7 districts, 18,000 guerrillas emerged from the mountains. At dawn, demolition teams from the 66th Regiment moved into position along Highway 4. Charges were set on bridge supports, timers synchronized. Before long, explosions were rippling through the mountain valleys as concrete and steel collapsed into gorges, cutting Japanese supply lines in multiple locations simultaneously. Along the coast, the 121st Regiment attacked Japanese positions in coordinated strikes, hammering garrison buildings with mortar rounds before sending in guerrillas to eliminate any remaining enemy troops. Some coastal outposts fell within hours. Others held out, only to find themselves surrounded, cut off from reinforcement. Inland, the 15th Regiment struck telephone and telegraph lines. Teams climbed poles and cut wires. Runners couldn't move between garrisons without running into ambushes. Japanese commanders found themselves blind, unable to communicate with their units, unable to coordinate a response. For 5 days, Volckmann coordinated attacks across northern Luzon while monitoring reports from his commanders. Japanese forces, already stretched thin, couldn't respond to threats everywhere at once. Yet the timing was no coincidence. Volckmann was laying low, groundwork for a moment that would stay with him forever. On January 9th, Volckmann climbed to an observation post at dawn. 50 miles away, across the Lingayen Gulf, he watched the invasion fleet arrive. Hundreds of ships, thousands of troops. After 3 years behind enemy lines, American forces were finally landing in northern Luzon. Volckmann would later write, quote, "As I quietly stood there, gazing on the awe-inspiring scene, I'm sure my eyes filled with tears." That afternoon, Volckmann made his way to the beach where the 6th Army was establishing its headquarters. The same beach where his war had started 3 years ago, where the 11th Infantry fought its delaying action against the Japanese advance. He changed into a freshly starched uniform made by a guerrilla tailor for the meeting with Lieutenant General Walter Kruger, 6th Army commander. Kruger recognized him immediately. They'd served together years ago at Fort Sam Houston, back when Volckmann was just a company commander in the 2nd Infantry Division. Now, Volckmann commanded 18,000 men, and Kruger had orders for him. Kruger's plan was ambitious. To break General Yamashita's defense in northern Luzon, he needed pressure from all sides. 3 U.S. divisions, The 25th, 32nd, and 33rd Infantry would attack from the south and west. Yusufip NL would be the 4th Division, attacking from the north. Volckmann's mission would be to drive south along Highway 4 toward Buntok, cutting off the Cagayan Valley. The valley was Yamashita's last major food source. Control it, and the Japanese defensive position would collapse. For the first time in 3 years, Volckmann, recently given a temporary promotion to colonel, would command conventional military operations. He organized 3 of his regiments, the 15th, 66th, and 121st Infantry, supported by 2 field artillery battalions. Division-size force, division-level operations. This wasn't guerrilla warfare anymore. As Yusufip NL advanced along Highway 4, they captured town after town. The 121st Regiment seized the port of San Fernando, giving U.S. forces access to one of northern Luzon's best harbors. The 15th Regiment captured Gabu Airfield, providing an emergency landing strip 150 miles behind enemy lines. The 66th Regiment pushed inland, clearing Japanese positions village by village. They then reached Basang Pass. The Japanese 19th Division held the high ground, entrenched positions commanding the narrow mountain pass, the only route to Buntok. Volckmann studied the terrain. His guerrillas knew every ridge and trail in these mountains, but that advantage meant little against prepared defensive positions. This would be a direct assault against veteran troops in dominant terrain. Volckmann attacked in late March. For weeks, his Filipino guerrillas fought up impossibly steep slopes, clawing their way over terrain where one misstep meant death. The merciless weather exacerbated the danger. In the mornings, the fog was often so thick that the men could barely see 5 yards in front of them, while at night, temperatures dropped considerably. The men would be left shivering in uniforms soaked through from the day's rain, unable to light fires that would give away their positions. Meanwhile, Japanese machine guns swept the approaches from elevated positions. Mortar shells and artillery fire from hidden positions on Mount Bukwal turned whole sections of the mountainside into eruptions of rock and shrapnel. Grenades were hurled back and forth across gaps too narrow for rifles. Men fought hand-to-hand on knife-edge ridges, and Japanese soldiers charged from tunnels with fixed bayonets. Filipino guerrillas met them with their bolos and rifle butts when ammunition ran low. Volckmann's forces gradually pushed forward, but on May 17th, Japanese launched a major counterattack. The 121st Infantry's lines collapsed. Men were pushed back across ridges they'd spent weeks capturing. Some units simply disintegrated, and soldiers scattered across the mountains. The guerrillas lost artillery pieces they couldn't evacuate. In 2 weeks of savage fighting, 150 of Volckmann's men lost their lives, while 315 were wounded. Volckmann pulled the shattered 121st back and brought in fresh troops, the 15th Infantry from the coast, the 66th Infantry from Baguio. By June 1st, he had 3 full regiments and American artillery support. Now he would hit them with overwhelming force. On June 10th, the 1st Battalion, 121st Infantry, the same unit routed in May, launched a final assault on Bukwal Ridge, the last stronghold before Basang Pass. For 24 hours, they fought the bloodiest battle of the campaign. When it ended, 172 Japanese bodies littered the ridge. Now Volckmann had to finish the job. From June 13th through dawn on June 14th, American artillery pounded Japanese positions without pause before companies K and L charged the last positions to cut down the final defenders. As they reached the peak, they waved an olive-drab GI towel to mark their victory. Basang Pass had finally fallen. The route to Buntok lay open. Volckmann's regiments pushed through, capturing the town and severing Japanese access to the Cagayan Valley. Combined with U.S. Army successes at Baleta Pass and Baguio, Yamashita's defensive line was broken. The cost was heavy. 900 of Volckmann's men had been lost, 2,360 wounded. But they'd accomplished their mission. The Northern Front had pinned down the Japanese 19th Division, preventing reinforcement of Yamashita's main defense. They'd cut off his last major food supply, and they'd proven that Filipino guerrillas, properly organized and fed, could fight as effectively as any U.S. division. By August 15th, 1945, Yusufip NL forces were just 5 miles from General Yamashita's headquarters. They'd fought 218 consecutive days of combat, not counting the 2 years of guerrilla operations before. The Japanese commander, cornered in the mountains with nowhere left to retreat, finally surrendered. General Kruger's after-action report praised Volckmann's forces for providing 6th Army operations with, quote, invaluable support. MacArthur went further, declaring that Yusufip NL had accomplished the mission of a frontline U.S. division. The official tally showed the scale of what Volckmann had built. His guerrillas had engaged roughly 85,000 of Yamashita's 150,000 troops. They had taken an estimated 52,000 enemy lives and captured 32,000 Japanese soldiers. Though Volckmann knew the numbers were probably inflated, what mattered was the result. Northern Luzon was liberated, and his men had done it. On September 3, 1945, Volckmann received orders to attend the formal Japanese surrender conference for Luzon. The ceremony would be held at Kiangan, Ipugan Province, the same village where he'd established his first guerrilla camp in December 1942. The Allied delegation was made up of some of the most important senior officers from multiple nations: Lieutenant General Jonathan Wainwright, who surrendered Bataan 3 years ago, Lieutenant General Wilhelm Steyer, Major General Edmund Levy, British Lieutenant General Arthur Percival. Colonel Russell Volckmann, still just 33 years old, was the lowest-ranking officer in the room, and he sat at the far end of the table. But the fact that he was there was a recognition of the crucial role he'd played in the Allied victory and the enormous risk he'd taken to maintain an active American presence in the Philippines, when most others had surrendered. Volckmann had escaped Bataan as a fugitive with one companion and a desperate plan. He was leaving this table as the architect of one of the most successful guerrilla campaigns in American military history. The kid who graduated near the bottom of his West Point class had just helped win a war. With the conflict over, in December 1945, Russell Volckmann returned to the United States for the first time in over 5 years. Yet, after just 2 months of leave and medical treatment, he was required to return to the Philippines to tie up loose ends. When he was finally allowed to go home permanently in July 1946, it was far from a happy return. His wife Nancy requested a divorce, and his wartime illnesses, malaria, dysentery, stomach ulcers, the accumulated damage of constant stress, kept him in and out of the hospital for a year and a half. But by early 1948, Volckmann's treatment was complete, and he was ready to make what would perhaps be his greatest contribution to the U.S. Armed Forces of all. At Chief of Staff Dwight Eisenhower's request, he began work on what would become the Army's first official counterinsurgency doctrine, based on his hard-won experience in the Philippines. FM 3120, Operations Against Guerrilla Forces, was published in September 1950. The timing couldn't have been better. 3 months earlier, North Korea had invaded South Korea. The Communist North made extensive use of guerrillas, and regular U.S. Army doctrine was failing against them. MacArthur requested Volckmann immediately. Now a lieutenant colonel again, after post-war rank reductions, Volckmann was appointed executive officer of the Special Activities Group Far East Command, planning and conducting guerrilla operations behind North Korean lines. However, after 6 months, his old medical conditions, likely a severe stomach ulcer from his Philippine years, forced his evacuation. But Volckmann wasn't done yet. Back in the States, he began a new writing assignment. In 1951, FM 3121, Organization and Conduct of Guerrilla Warfare, was published. This manual would become the doctrinal foundation for the Army's Special Forces. Brigadier General Robert A. McClure recruited Volckmann to serve as Chief of Plans for the Office of Psychological Warfare Special Operations Division. Joining him were Colonel Aaron Bank, an OSS veteran from Europe, Colonel Wendell Fertig, who had led guerrillas on Mindanao, and Colonel Melvin Blair from Merrill's Marauders. Together, they created the structure and doctrine for what would become the U.S. Army Special Forces, the legendary Green Berets. While Bank is usually considered the founder of the Green Berets, he himself often highlighted Volckmann's role in providing the blueprint for how they would operate. In a 1969 letter, he gave Volckmann credit for, quote, the development of position, planning, and policy papers that helped see the establishment of Special Forces units in the active Army. In 1956, at 45 years old, Volckmann completed parachute training at Fort Benning, becoming one of the oldest soldiers ever to complete the course. That December, he was promoted to Brigadier General and served as Assistant Division Commander of the 82nd Airborne Division. The following year, after 23 years of service, Russell Volckmann retired from the Army and went into the manufacturing industry, though he continued providing his expertise whenever his country needed it. For example, in 1962, the U.S. Air Force requested that he lead a RAND Corporation study panel to analyze the viability of using air support in counterinsurgency missions. In 1981, Volckmann was diagnosed with cancer, and he passed away the following year at the age of 70. His funeral was attended by several representatives of the Philippine government, as well as his old comrade, Brigadier General Donald Blackburn, who had joined Volckmann in his refusal to surrender and in his daring escape to the mountains of northern Luzon 40 years earlier.